I don't know why I've become so obsessed with this story. Maybe it's the small-town connection, or maybe it's the sheer mystery of it all. Either way, it keeps me up at night. It happened back in 1997, but if you ask anyone from around here, they'll still tell you about it like it was yesterday. The woman's name was Margaret Hayes. She wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Early 30s, worked at the local diner, kept to herself mostly. Her landlord, Mr. Grayson, said she always paid her rent on time, never caused any trouble. Just a quiet, small-town life, until the day she disappeared. It was her boss at the diner who first reported her missing. Margaret hadn't shown up for work, and no one could reach her. Her car was still parked outside her small duplex, but when Mr. Grayson went to check, the door was locked. At first, everyone assumed she'd just taken off without telling anyone. People do that sometimes, right? But then Mr. Grayson let himself in with a spare key to check on things. That's when things got strange. The apartment was clean. Too clean. Not in an obsessive way, but in a deliberate, almost staged way. There were no dishes in the sink, no laundry in the basket, and no signs of a struggle. Everything was perfectly in place, except for one thing. A VHS tape sitting dead center on the kitchen counter, like it had been left there on purpose. Mr. Grayson didn't know what to make of it, so he handed it over to the police. They popped it into a VCR right there in the station, probably thinking it was nothing, maybe a farewell message or something. But what they saw on that tape, well, it still gives me chills just thinking about it. The footage was grainy, like it had been recorded on one of those old camcorders people used in the 90s. It showed Margaret sitting on the floor of a small dark room. She was crying, her face streaked with tears, her hair a mess. She looked terrified. At one point, she begged for help, saying over and over, "Please, someone find me, please." But that wasn't the worst part. In the background of the video, you could hear it, this faint, almost inaudible laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was there, just barely audible under her sobs, and it didn't sound human. It was slow, deliberate, and hollow, like someone trying to mimic a laugh without any real emotion behind it. The police tore the town apart looking for her. They searched every abandoned building, every wooded area, every basement and crawl space. But they found nothing. No clues, no leads, no Margaret. It was like she'd been swallowed up by the earth. 2 weeks passed, and the case started to cool down. That's when the second tape showed up. This time, it wasn't left in her apartment. It was mailed directly to the police station. No return address, just a blank envelope with the tape inside. The footage was similar to the first, but worse. Margaret looked thinner, paler, her eyes sunken. She didn't cry this time. She just stared into the camera, trembling, as the same laugh echoed in the background. And then the tapes started coming annually. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, a new tape would arrive. The footage never changed much. Margaret in that same dark room, looking worse each time. By the 5th year, she was barely recognizable. Her cheeks were hollow, her skin almost translucent. She didn't even move anymore. She just sat there staring into the lens as if she knew people were watching but couldn't do anything to help her. The laugh was always there too, faint but constant. The tapes stopped coming after 2002. The police station never figured out who sent them, where they were from, or even where they were filmed. The whole thing became a kind of urban legend. Some people think Margaret was kidnapped by someone local, someone who wanted to toy with the town. Others say it was something darker, something not human. And then there are those who believe she's still alive somewhere, trapped in that room, waiting for someone to find her. I've seen copies of the tapes. They're floating around online if you know where to look, though I wouldn't recommend it. There's something wrong about them. It's not just the content, it's the way they feel. Like the room Margaret's in doesn't quite exist in our reality. Like it's somewhere else entirely. Every time I drive past her old duplex, I think about that first tape, sitting on the counter like an invitation. Whoever, or whatever, did this wanted to be seen. They wanted to be remembered, and they succeeded. But the part that haunts me the most? In the last tape, right before it cuts off, Margaret finally speaks. Her voice is hoarse, barely a whisper, but you can make it out if you listen closely. She says, "It's not over." And I don't think it ever will be. I'm not big on conspiracy theories or urban legends, but this one still gives me chills. I grew up hearing bits and pieces of the story, snippets my parents and neighbors whispered around campfires. It always felt like one of those exaggerated tales people tell to spook kids, but when I got older, I decided to dig into it myself. What I found? Well, it's hard to forget. It happened back in 1995. A family from Denver, a mom, dad, and their 2 kids, decided to take a winter vacation in the Rockies. They booked a week at a remote snow lodge, the kind of place that doesn't even pop up on travel websites. It was run by locals, quiet, secluded, with a reputation for incredible views and deep powder skiing. Perfect for a family getaway. The last time anyone saw them was the day before their departure. The lodge owner, an older guy named Henry, had chatted with the dad about the snow conditions and how the family had loved their stay. Nothing out of the ordinary. They were set to leave the next morning, but they didn't. When the lodge's cleaning staff arrived later that day to prep the rooms for new guests, they found the place off. The family's rental SUV was still in the driveway, snow piled up on the windshield. Inside, the lodge was eerily quiet. No laughter from the kids, no suitcases packed by the door. Just silence. The first thing that stood out was breakfast. Plates of eggs and pancakes were still sitting on the dining table, half-eaten, with steam faintly visible in the freezing air. It was as if the family and staff had vanished mid-meal. Jackets hung by the door, boots were neatly lined up, and personal belongings were scattered as if the day was just starting. But there wasn't a single person in sight. The cleaning crew called the local sheriff, who brought a team up to investigate. They scoured the lodge, every room, every closet, every crawl space. Nothing. The family wasn't there. Neither were the staff members who had been staying on site. 5 in total. Outside, search teams found tracks in the snow, leading away from the lodge and into the woods. At first, they thought it might be a planned hike gone wrong. But here's where it gets strange. The tracks weren't hurried or chaotic. They were neat, deliberate, as if everyone had calmly walked into the forest together. And then, about 200 yards in, they stopped. Just stopped. No signs of struggle, no scattered belongings, just an empty expanse of untouched snow, as if they'd all vanished into thin air. The rescue effort became a full-scale operation. Helicopters, dogs, volunteers, you name it. Days turned into weeks, but they didn't find a single clue. No bodies, no clothing, no signs of life. It was like the mountain had swallowed them whole. That would have been weird enough, but the locals had their own theories. Stories about the lodge's land being cursed. Some said it was sacred to the Ute tribe, and that building on it had angered the spirits. Others whispered about old rituals tied to the area, something about sacrifices to appease the mountain and ensure safe winters. One of the eeriest details? The lodge had no official records, no deeds, no permits, nothing. It had been there for decades, but no one seemed to know who built it or who truly owned it. When reporters tried to dig deeper, they hit dead ends, literally. The story was buried, overshadowed by other news, and the lodge was left to rot. About 10 years later, a group of hikers stumbled upon the lodge. It was still standing, though barely. The windows were shattered, the roof caved in. Nature had reclaimed most of it. They ventured inside and found it exactly as the sheriff's team had described. Plates still on the table, furniture covered in dust but undisturbed. One of the hikers claimed to hear faint laughter coming from the woods, but by then, the group was too spooked to stay. The lodge was demolished in the early 2000s, but the land remains untouched. Locals say animals won't go near it, that the area is always eerily quiet. Some even claim to see lights in the woods at night moving in patterns that don't make sense. I visited the site once, just to see for myself. It was years after the demolition, but you could still feel it. the weight in the air, like the land itself was holding its breath. The ground felt wrong under my boots, soft in places where it shouldn't have been. I didn't stick around long. Sometimes I think about that family and the staff. What could have made them all leave so calmly? Was it fear? Something else? I don't know. And maybe I don't want to. But every now and then, when the wind howls outside my window at night, I can almost hear it. The faint, distant echo of footsteps in the snow. The story of Michael Connors still gets whispered about in late-night conversations at that office. I don't work there, but I've heard the accounts from people who do, and honestly, it's enough to keep you looking over your shoulder in any quiet building. Back in 2003, Connors was a well-known private investigator. Not flashy, not like the ones you see on TV, but thorough. If you had a problem and needed answers, he was your guy. At the time, he was working on a high-stakes corporate fraud case involving some big players in the finance world. The kind of case that could ruin reputations, bankrupt companies, maybe even put people in jail. From what I've gathered, Connors was getting close to something. Too close. It was a Friday night when he disappeared. Security footage shows him walking into his office at 10:17 p.m. He looked normal. No signs of stress, no one following him. He used his key to get in, shut the door behind him, and that was it. The cameras never caught him leaving. When his assistant showed up the next morning, the door was locked from the inside. She knocked, waited, knocked again. Nothing. Eventually, she got the building manager to unlock it, thinking maybe Connors had fallen asleep or something. What they found? It still gives me chills just recounting it. The office was untouched. His jacket was draped over the back of his chair, his coffee cup half full and still warm. His files were spread out on the desk, like he'd been going through them when something interrupted him. But there was one strange detail. A folder with the words, "Do not ignore," written in bold red marker was missing. The assistant swore she'd seen it there the day before. No signs of struggle, no signs of Connors. It was like he had just vanished. The police were called, of course. They dusted for prints, searched the building, checked the security tapes over and over. Nothing. The case went cold fast. Theories ranged from a pre-planned disappearance, maybe Connors had gotten too deep and went into hiding, to something more sinister, like someone in the case making sure he never got to reveal what he'd found. And then the report started. A few months after his disappearance, employees working late started hearing things over the office intercom system. At first, it was just static, easily dismissed as a malfunction, but then people started hearing a voice. "Help me." That's what they said it said. Faint and distorted, like someone speaking from far away. Other times it was just his name, Connors. I know what you're thinking, probably a prank, right? But here's the thing. The intercom system had been disconnected a week after Connors vanished. The company claimed it was just outdated and no longer needed. So where was the voice coming from? One janitor, a guy named Luis, said he heard the voice while cleaning late one night. It called his name, clear as day, and when he turned around, every single light in the office went out. He quit the next morning and refused to talk about it again. Then there were the files. A new employee found a folder in the office archive room almost a year later. It wasn't labeled with a case number or anything official. It just had those same words. Do not ignore. The employee swears they didn't know about Connors' case at the time. They opened it, read a few pages, and then bolted out of the building. They wouldn't say what was in it, only that it was beyond dangerous. The folder disappeared again before anyone else could see it. To this day, Connors' disappearance remains unsolved. The building has changed hands a few times, but the rumors persist. People still report hearing his voice, seeing his shadow in the hallway, or feeling a cold draft when they walk past his old office, room 314. And that folder? It's never stayed hidden for long. It always finds its way back into circulation, almost like Connors is still trying to get someone, anyone, to finish what he started. If you ever find yourself working late in a quiet office and you hear a voice on the intercom, don't answer. And whatever you do, if you see a folder marked Do Not Ignore, ignore it. I don't know why I'm writing this down. Maybe it's to convince myself that what I heard wasn't real, or maybe it's because I can't stop thinking about it. The voice, the trail, and the ranger's warning I almost ignored. The first time I heard the story, I was on a weekend trip to a national park with my buddy Luke. We'd rented a couple of cabins, stocked up on snacks and beer, and planned to hike some of the lesser-known trails to avoid the crowds. Luke had been to the park before and swore by this one old trail called Lost Hollow. He said it was practically abandoned now, but the views were worth it. When we checked in at the ranger station, the guy behind the desk, graying hair, kind of gruff, paused when Luke mentioned Lost Hollow. He leaned forward like he was about to let us in on some big secret. "You ever hear about the ranger who disappeared up there?" he asked. I shook my head, but Luke nodded. "You mean the guy from the 80s? They found his stuff, but never him, right?" "Yeah," the ranger said, his voice low. "They say he went up to check out some reports, people hearing voices, weird sounds. His notebook was the only clue they found. Said something about not following the voice. Creepy, huh?" Luke laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the look in the ranger's eyes. It wasn't like he was telling a ghost story to scare tourists. It was more like he was warning us. We hit the trail the next morning just as the sun was coming up. At first it was amazing. Quiet, peaceful, not another soul in sight. The kind of solitude you can only get deep in the woods. But the farther we went, the more unsettling it felt. It started with the whispers. At first I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but then I realized it was too deliberate, too human. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a woman. Her voice faint and melodic, drifting through the air. "Did you hear that?" I asked Luke. "Hear what?" he said, turning around. The whispering stopped. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but shrugged it off. Nothing, just the wind, I guess. We kept going, but the feeling of being watched never went away. Every so often I'd hear branches snapping behind us, like someone, or something, was following. Luke didn't seem to notice, which only made it worse. By the time we reached the halfway point, I was ready to turn back. That's when we heard her. "Help me." It was a woman's voice, faint but desperate, coming from somewhere off the trail. I froze, my heart pounding. Luke looked at me, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. "Yeah," I said, "but we shouldn't." "Hello?" The voice called again, a little louder this time. "Please, I'm lost." Luke started toward the sound, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait," I said. "Remember what the ranger said about the notebook?" "Come on, man," he said, shaking me off. "What if someone's actually in trouble?" I wanted to argue, but another voice stopped me. It was a man this time, low and clear, coming from somewhere behind us. "Don't follow her voice." Luke froze. What the hell was that? I turned around, my stomach twisting into knots. There was no one there, just the trees and the shadows stretching across the trail. The woman's voice called out again, closer now. "Please, I need help." Luke hesitated, his eyes darting between me and the woods. I could see the conflict on his face. He didn't want to ignore someone who might be in danger, but he also couldn't explain the other voice we just heard. "We need to go," I said firmly. "But now." I grabbed his arm and started back down the trail, half expecting him to resist. To my relief, he followed. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they got louder, more insistent, like they were trying to lure us back. The woman's voice shifted, growing sharper, angrier. "Don't leave me," she screamed. I glanced over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. Standing in the distance just off the trail was a figure. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was clearly a woman. Her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her arms hanging limply at her sides. She didn't move, but the voice grew louder, echoing in my ears. "Come back." I ran. By the time we reached the trailhead, I was gasping for air, my legs trembling. Luke was right behind me, his face pale and drenched in sweat. Neither of us said a word as we got into the car and drove back to the cabin. It wasn't until we were safely inside, with the doors locked and the blinds drawn, that Luke finally spoke. What the hell was that? I didn't have an answer. We left the park the next morning, cutting our trip short. On the way out, I spotted the ranger from before, standing outside the station. He gave me a knowing look, like he didn't need to ask what had happened. I've thought about that day a lot since then, replaying every moment in my head. Part of me wonders if we imagined the whole thing, if it was just the wind and our overactive imaginations. But then I remember the figure in the woods, the voice that warned us, and the words scrawled in that missing ranger's notebook. Don't follow her voice. She's not human. I don't think I'll ever step foot in that park again. You ever stumble across one of those stories that sticks with you even though it shouldn't? Like the kind of thing you hear late at night and brush off, but deep down, it just lingers. That's how it was for me with the place on Hollow Creek Drive. I first heard about it back in 2010, when I was working night shifts at a diner. It was one of those slow nights. Just me, the cook, and this regular named Pete who always came in for coffee and a slice of pie. We'd been chatting about urban legends when he brought it up. You ever hear about the Hollow Creek complex? He asked, stirring his coffee like he wasn't about to drop the most unsettling thing I'd ever heard. I shook my head. What's that? He leaned in like he didn't want anyone else to hear. A whole apartment complex emptied out in one night. Everyone just gone. I laughed, thinking it was some ghost story to pass the time, but Pete didn't crack a smile. They left everything behind, he continued. Dinner's still on the tables, lights on, some showers running, like they just got up and walked out. Nobody saw a damn thing. And the weirdest part? They found a message in the hallway, "We've gone home," written in red paint. I shrugged it off, but something about the way he said it, like he wasn't just repeating a story, but remembering it, gave me the creeps. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I had a day off, so I drove out to Hollow Creek. The building was gone, just an empty lot fenced off with no trespassing signs. But even in broad daylight, the place felt wrong. Like the air was heavier there, and the silence wasn't just quiet, it was empty. I asked around, and most people just rolled their eyes. Urban legend, one guy said. Some kids probably pulled a prank and it got blown out of proportion. But not everyone brushed it off. One woman, a retired teacher who lived down the street, told me she remembered the night it happened. It was the strangest thing, she said. I was grading papers, and around 10 p.m., I noticed all the lights in the complex were on. Every window was lit up. I thought maybe there was some kind of event, but it was so quiet. Too quiet. No music, no voices, nothing. Just this awful, heavy silence. I went to bed, and the next morning the lights were still on, but the parking lot was empty. I called the property manager, but she wouldn't say much, just that the residents were relocated. Relocated, like that explained anything. I found an old news article about it online. Most of it was just speculation. Police didn't find any signs of foul play, and there were no reports of large vehicles or unusual activity that night. But the part that stood out was an interview with a neighbor who claimed they heard footsteps around 3 a.m., dozens of them marching in unison. The article also mentioned that the "We've gone home" message wasn't written in red paint like Pete said. It was blood. I wish I'd stopped there, but no, I had to keep digging. A few months later, I found out the lot had been sold to a developer who planned to build a shopping plaza. Construction had started, so I drove out to take a look. The workers didn't want to talk much, but one guy let something slip. "We keep hearing things," he said, lowering his voice. "Voices, footsteps, tools going missing, and the dirt, there's something wrong with it. It's too soft, like it's been disturbed." I asked if they'd found anything while digging, but he just shook his head. They won't tell us if they did. A few weeks later, the project was abandoned. No explanation, no follow-up, just a half-dug lot surrounded by chain-link fencing. I haven't been back since, but every now and then, I see something online. People claiming they hear voices when they drive past, or that their radios cut out near the site. I don't know if any of it's true, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever happened at Hollow Creek wasn't some urban legend. It was real. And whatever home those people went to, I hope to God it's nowhere near here. I first heard about the Forest of Forgotten Names from a guy I met in college. His name was Trevor, and he was one of those conspiracy theory junkies who could turn even the most innocent news story into something sinister. But this one wasn't like the rest. When Trevor talked about this forest, he didn't smirk or crack a joke like he usually did. He just said, "Some places don't want you there," and left it at that. At the time, I thought he was being dramatic, but now I wish I'd listened. The story goes that in 2015, 3 college friends, Jen, Marcus, and Caleb, went hiking in a remote forest somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. It wasn't on any official trail map, just one of those spots people talk about in whispers, a place locals warn you to stay away from. The forest didn't even have a real name, just a nickname people used online, the Forest of Forgotten Names. According to their families, the 3 friends were experienced hikers. They had all the right gear, a detailed itinerary, and even a backup plan in case something went wrong. But none of that mattered. They vanished without a trace. Well, almost without a trace. 2 days after they were reported missing, search and rescue teams found Caleb's phone. It was lying in the middle of a clearing, completely undamaged, as if someone had gently placed it there. There was no sign of the hikers, no footprints leading to or from the spot. Just that phone. What they found on it still haunts me. The video starts off normal enough. You see Jen holding the camera, laughing and making fun of Marcus for tripping over a root. Caleb's voice is in the background, joking about how they'll all go viral if they fall into a bear trap. It's the kind of carefree, dumb stuff you'd expect from a group of friends on a hike. But then, about a minute in, something shifts. The laughter stops. The camera starts shaking as Jen spins around trying to capture something in the trees. Marcus asks, "Did you hear that?" Caleb tells him to relax, but his voice wavers. Jen zooms in on a cluster of trees. At first it looks like nothing, just shadows and branches swaying in the breeze. But then you notice them. Figures, standing perfectly still, half hidden among the trees. They aren't moving, but they aren't natural either. Their shapes are wrong, too tall, too thin. And even though the camera never gets close enough to show faces, you can tell they're watching. The video cuts out for a few seconds, and when it comes back, it's chaos. The 3 of them are running. The camera's bouncing so you can't see much, but you can hear Caleb shouting, "Stay together!" while Marcus yells something incoherent. Jen is crying, muttering, "They're not real, they're not real." And then, silence. The camera steadies, and you see the 3 of them standing in a circle, facing outward like they're trying to protect themselves from something. They're mumbling. At first it sounds like gibberish, but if you listen closely you can hear fragments of words. Names. Over and over they're repeating names. And those figures? They're closer now. Dozens of them surrounding the friends, still perfectly still, perfectly silent. The final frame is the worst. Jen points the camera at herself. Her face is pale, her eyes wide with terror. She leans in close and whispers, "Don't let them take our names." The screen goes black. That's where the story should end, but it doesn't. When the authorities tried to identify the hikers, something bizarre happened. Their names were gone. Not just from the video, but from every official record, birth certificates, school transcripts, social media accounts. Even their families couldn't find old photos or keepsakes with their names on them. It was like they'd been erased, scrubbed clean from existence. The media picked up the story for a while, dubbing it the Vanishing Names case. But without solid evidence, it fizzled out. People moved on. Except for Trevor. He became obsessed with the case, diving into forums and digging up every rumor he could find about the forest. He told me that names have power, that taking someone's name is like taking their identity, their soul. I didn't believe him until last week. I was cleaning out an old hard drive when I found a folder labeled FOFN. Inside was a single file, the video. Trevor must have given it to me at some point, though I don't remember him doing it. Out of morbid curiosity, I watched it again. And now, I can't stop hearing my name. It's faint, just a whisper on the edge of my hearing, but it's there. Always there. In the wind, in the hum of my fridge, in the static of my TV. I don't know what to do, but I can tell you this. Don't go looking for the forest of forgotten names. And if you do, don't let them take yours.